My child, my Lars, he is gone, taken from his bed. The only thing that we found was a scrap of black clothing. It feels like cotton, but it's softer, thicker. Lars came into my bedroom yesterday, screaming at the top of his lungs that the angel is outside. I asked him what he was talking about, and he told me some nonsense fairy story about their Grossmann. He said he went into the groves by our village and found one of the cows dead, hanging from a tree. I thought nothing of it at first, but now he's gone. We must find Lars, and my family must leave before we are killed. I am sorry, my son. I should have listened. May God forgive me. After waking up in a jolt, the girl laid in bed a few seconds longer. Reaching over to switch on her bedside lamp, she tried to remember what exactly had stolen her sweet slumber away. When she couldn't, the brunette swung her legs over the side of the bed and heaved herself up. Checking the time on her phone, she snorted when she saw it was midnight, the witching hour. Knowing that sleep would only evade her, she left her bedroom for the kitchen, a good cup of coffee on her mind. As she passed by her front door, a chill spread like liquid fire down her spine. It's only winter, she told herself, focusing again on the coffee plan. Measuring out scoops, water, and preparing her cup kept her occupied, but as the dark liquid boiled, she had nothing left to keep her mind from wandering off. The chill returned, and she couldn't help but glance behind her to the front door. It stood there innocently enough, just like always. The deadbolt was still in place, and she could see nothing amiss with it. Turning back to her coffee, she did her best to forget about the feeling. With her cup in hand, she started back towards her bedroom. As she walked by the front door, she decided that a quick glance out of the peephole would help calm her restless mind. The chill worsened with each step she took towards the door and further away from the safety and warmth of her blankets. She pressed her empty hand against the cold metal door and took a deep breath before leading her eye to the peephole. At first, she could only see an inky blackness that somehow seemed to swirl in itself. When she blinked in surprise, the void melted away. She wished it hadn't. In its place, there stood only what she could only guess was once a man. The limbs were long and inhumanly awkward, with bulky joints branching off into several arms, not unlike the branches of a tree. The creature was draped in a black suit, somehow making the thing more nightmarish to her. The icing on the proverbial cake, however, was what passed as the hellish thing's face. It was as though her mind blurred a ghastly visage to spare itself further shock and horror. She shoved herself away from the door with the hand still pressing against it. The scalding mug of coffee fell, the liquid burning her bare legs as she fell backwards and tried to crawl away from the door. She knew, somehow, that her mind hadn't been playing tricks on her. As she walked away from the door, she watched as tendrils as black as the void snake around through the cracks. The girl was trapped between the instinct to flee and a gut feeling to not turn her back on the door. When the door jolted, the urge to flee overcame her, and she slipped in the burning liquid as she tried to make it back to her room. She knew deep down that she was trapping herself in a corner, but she had to get away from the door. The girl was halfway down the hallway when she heard the previously locked door creak open. She screamed and slipped into a wall, cracking her chin on it and stunning her. After that, there was only blackness. Nicole? A warm male voice snapped the woman out of her trance. As she turned around, she was met by one of her sister's doctors. She nodded, not sure if she should say anything, or even if she could find her voice if she did have something to say. That morning, she had gotten an urgent phone call from the hospital, saying that her sister, Lindsay, was there. Before they even let her see her, the doctors had pulled her off to the side and insisted that they talk to her about what might have happened. Phrases like self-inflicted and assault had been thrown around, and Nicole felt her mind reel. She still hadn't fully understood what they had been saying until she saw Lindsay with her own eyes. Her little sister had a bandage wrapped around her head, covering both her ears as well as her eyes. They said it was to keep her now deadened eyes from drying out, and to try to keep infection out of the wounds Lindsay had made to her ears. The doctors had guessed that either she or someone else had jammed a pencil into them to keep her off balance or to deafen herself against something. There was the mix of first and second degree burns on her hands, legs and feet from what was assumed to be the coffee her neighbors found slipped all over the entry to her apartment. As Nicole walked into her sister's hospital room for the first time, she thought she spied the silhouette of a man in the window. That, she knew, was impossible. Her sister's room was on the third story of the hospital. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the very presence of Almighty God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate or even sense the outside world, he was all alone with just his thoughts. The scientists kept monitoring him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. But after 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it to be an onset of psychosis, the scientist paid little attention to the man's concerns. Then 2 days after that, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking to him, and even more, he could communicate back. Of course, the scientists were intrigued, but were not thoroughly convinced. Not until the subject started naming the dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. As one can expect, at this point, a sizable portion of the scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against a wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientist for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. And this tactic worked for at least 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. It was then that the subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his very dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now claimed that the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientist rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to the table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For about 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made a focused eye contact with a scientist for the first time during the study. He whispered,
I have spoken to God, and He has abandoned us.
Then he ceased to move at all, and his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death.
Message begins. We made a mistake. That is the simple, undeniable truth of the matter, however painful it may be. The flaw was not in our observatories, for those machines were as perfect as we could make, and they showed us only the unfiltered light of truth. The flaw was also not in the predictor, for it is a device of pure, infallible logic, turning raw data into meaningful information without the taint of emotion or bias. No, the flaw was within us, the orchestrators of this disaster, the sentients who fought themselves beyond such failings. We are responsible. It began a short while ago, as these things are measured less than 6 to the power of 6 Deli ago, though I suspect our systems of measure will mean very little by the time anyone receives this transmission. We detected faint radio signals from a blossoming intelligence 2 to the 14th Delis outward from the galactic core as photons travel. At first, crude and unstructured, these leaking broadcasts quickly grew in complexity and strength, as did the messages they carried. Through our observatories, we watched a cycle of strife and violence populated by a barbaric species of short-lived, fast-breeding vermin. They were brutal and uncultured things which stabbed and shot and burned each other with no regard for life or purpose. Even their concepts of art spoke of conflict and pain. They divided themselves according to some bizarre cultural patterns and set their every industry to cause of death. They terrified us. But we were older and wiser and so very far away, so we did not fret. Then we watched them split the atom and breach the heavens within the breadth of one of their single, short generations. And we began to worry. When they began actively transmitting messages and greetings into space, we felt fear and horror. Their transmissions promised peace and camaraderie to any who were listening, but we had watched them for too long to buy into such transparent deceptions. They knew we were out there, and they were coming for us. The orchestrators consulted the predictor, and the output was dire. They would multiply and grow and flood out of their home system like some uncountable tide of devourer worms, consuming all that lay in their path. It might be 6 to the power of 8 Delis, but they would destroy us if left unchecked. Vaking carapaces, we decided to act and sealed our fate. The gift of mercy was 8 to the power of 4 strides long, with a mouth 2/4 that in diameter, filled with many 4 to the power of 4 weights of machinery, fuel, and ballast. It would push itself up to 2/8 of light speed with its onboard fuel and then begin to consume interstellar primary element 2/2 to feed its unlimited acceleration. It would be traveling at nearly light speed when it hit. They would never see it coming. Its launch day was a day of mourning, celebration, and reflection. The horror of the act we had committed weighed heavily upon us all. The necessity of our crime did little to comfort us. The gift had barely cleared the outer cometary halo when the mistake was realized, but it was too late. The gift could not be caught, could not be recalled or diverted from its path. The architects and work crews, horrified at the awful power of the thing upon which they labored, had quietly self-terminated in droves, walking unshielded into radiation zones, neglecting proper null pressure, safety, or simply ceasing their nutrient consumption until their metabolic function stopped. The appalling cost in lives had forced the orchestrators to streamline the gift's design and construction. There had been no time for the design or implementation of anything beyond the simple massive engines and destabilizing systems. We could only watch in shame and horror as the light of genocide faded in infrared against the distant void. They grew and they changed in a handful of lifetimes. They abolished war, abandoned their violent tendencies, and turned themselves to the grand purpose of life and art. We watched them remake first themselves and then their world. Their frail, soft bodies gave way to gleaming metals and plastics. They unified their people through an omnipotent communications grid and produced art of such power and emotion the likes of which the galaxy has never seen before. Or again, because of us. They converted their home world into a paradise by their standards, and many 10 to the power of 6s of them poured out into the surrounding system with a rapidity and vigor that we could only envy. With bodies built to survive every environment from the daylit surface of their innermost world to the atmosphere of their largest gas giant and the cold void in between, they set out to sculpt their system into something beautiful. At first, we thought them to be simple miners, stripping the rocky planets and moons for vital resources. But then, we began to see the purpose to their construction, the artworks carved into every surface and traced across the system in glittering lights and dancing fusion trails. And still, our terrible gift approached. They had less than 2/2 D-lies to see it, following so closely on the tail of its own light. In that time, oh so brief, even by their fleeting lives, more than 10 over the power of 10 sentients prepared for death. Lovers exchanged last words, separated by worlds and the tyranny of light speed. Their planet-side engineers worked frantically to build sufficient transmission to upload countless masses with the necessary neural modification, while those above dumped lifetimes of music and literature from their databanks to make room for passengers. Those lacking the required hardware of the time to acquire it consigned themselves to death, lashed out in fear and pain, or simply went about their lives as best they could under the circumstances. The gift arrived suddenly. The light of its impact visible in our skies, shining bright and cruel even to the unaugmented ocular receptor. We watched, and we wept for our victims. Dead, so many Delis before the light of their doom had even reached us. Many 6 to the power of force of those who had been directly or even tangentially involved in the creation of the gift sealed their spiracles as a final penance for the small roles they had played in this atrocity. The light dimmed, the dust cleared, and our observatories refocused upon the place where their shining blue world had once hung in the void, and found only dust and a pale gleam of an orphaned moon wrapped in a thin burning wisp of atmosphere that had once belonged to its parent. Radiation and relativistic shrapnel had wiped out much of the inner system, and continent-sized chunks of molten rock carried screaming ghosts outward at interstellar escape velocities, damned to wander the great void for an eternity. The damage was apocalyptic. But not complete. From the shadows of the outer worlds, tiny points of light emerged. Thousands of fusion trails of single ships and world ships and everything in between. Many 10 to the power of 6s of survivors in flesh and steel and memory banks ready to rebuild. For a few moments, we felt relief, even joy, and we were filled with the hope that their culture and art would survive the terrible blow we had dealt them. Then came the message. Tightly focused at our star, transmitted simultaneously by hundreds of their ships.
Message ends.
In the late 40s of the last century, after a decade of private research involving experiments with binaural beat brainwave frequencies, extrasensory cognition, and rare extracts of a South American vine, Dr. Thomas Roosner perfected a technique whereby one could actually intrude into the psyche and see another's thoughts. Despite having exhaustively documented his rigorous work, he could find no institution that would even offer to review it. Forced to sell his invention, he found, by word of mouth, among those through whom he procured narcotics, a prospective buyer. The bête noire of an old New York family, Mr. John M. Dunn, a voyeuristic connoisseur of the supernatural and the obscene, who had squandered his idle youth in the great libraries of Paris, those catacombs of departed authors, rummaging through their hoards of dusty and obsolete works. A literary ghoul who disturbed with profane fingers the charnel houses of decayed philosophies. He readily agreed to the doctor's asking price without haggling, delighted at the prospect of exploring such a bizarre novelty. Once adept to the operation of the apparatus, Dunn paid Dr. Roosner off, and under an assumed name rented a shabby house within view of Sing Sing prison. In the timeless night, while the convicts fitfully slept, with the aid of a set of stolen blueprints and his new mind-reading device, he raided their memories, cell by cell at liberty, to savor the forbidden thrill of thefts, molestations, moonlit homicides, all in secret, without remorse or consequence. Within a month, the prisoners, telling each other about the nightmares from which they had all begun abruptly to awaken, discovered they shared striking similarities. First, processions of alligators and tortoises filed through a swamp crowded with faceless people and shrieking orchids. Next, a shadow man, at whom they looked directly but never could quite see, would watch them in utter stillness from an empty house while invisible hands probed behind their eyes, as they had to stand naked, legs locked in place, unable to run away. Their compared descriptions of the house were identical, including its location just outside the walls. By mutual agreement, it was planned that the first of them to receive parole or be released would search this house out to find if it really existed, and investigate the source of their troubling dreams. A few days after being freed, their chosen spy was able to inform them with a smuggled message in code that not only was the house real, but he had broken into it and found a gaunt mustached man in a silk smoking jacket, seated bolt upright, head thrust back, both eyes gaping, mouth stuck in a stiffened gasp, clenched hands gripping the arms of his chair in front of a scientific machine. A handwritten journal on the desk told a whole story of his adventures, prying unconstrained through their psyches, plundering the haunted memories of criminal after criminal, seeking ever more shameful and audacious experiences, until finally he wrote, on July 7th, of his overwhelming desire to witness telepathically the next execution in the prison's notorious electric chair. As the sun begins to set and the trees huddle together in small dark groups as if shielding themselves against the coming of night, you step quietly and quickly through the carpet of fallen leaves and stray twigs, recognizing and noting as you do every rustle, every snap of a branch created by your own footfalls. You note them so that you can distinguish them from the other sounds. The soft rustlings of leaves, the crack of bracken somewhere behind you. You increase your speed, knowing that night is not the only thing drawing closer. The sound increases as your pace and heartbeats quicken. You turn, and in the fading light catch a single glimpse of a hunched, crawling thing that is pursuing you, creeping forward like an animal and yet looking so horribly human. You only caught a single glimpse, but then you start to run. One glimpse is enough. During the summer of 2003, events in the northeastern United States involving a strange human-like creature sparked brief local media interest before an apparent blackout was enacted. Little or no information was left intact, as most online and written accounts of the creature were mysteriously destroyed. Primarily focused in rural New York State and once found in Idaho, self-proclaimed witnesses told stories of their encounters with a creature of unknown origin. Emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remain powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I've been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book. Firstly, a suicide note written in 1964.
As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain I have introduced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye.
Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope.
Dearest Lenny, I have prayed for you. He spoke your name.
Secondly, a journal entry translated from Spanish written in 1880.
I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and they pierced me. His wet hands. I will not sleep. His voice.
Then thirdly, a mariner's log written in 1691.
He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed, I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again at the request of the Rake.
And lastly, an extensive account from a witness in 2006.
3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip from Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids right to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m, I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him up in the process. I apologised and told him I thought he got out of bed, and when he turned to me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly his knee almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for half a second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or large headless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason, I was not instantly frightened of it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point, I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into a fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. And in a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of motion right along the bed until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds, or probably closer to 5, it just seemed like a while, just looking at my husband. The creature then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway leading to the kids' room. I screamed and ran to the light switch, planning to stop him before he could hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouching and hunched over about 20 feet away. He turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter Clara. The creature ran down the stairs while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "He is the Rake." My husband drove his car into the lake that night while rushing our daughter to the hospital. They did not survive. Being a small town, news got round pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got in contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now refer to as the Rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believe to be accounts of the Rake. None of them gave any details, history, or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages, then never mentioned it again. A ship's log explained nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the Rake. And that was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the Rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sounds of me rolling around in my bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the second week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleeping while blurring through, recording at 8 times the normal speed, and it still almost took an hour every day. On the first day of the third week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the Rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and I believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I have not seen the Rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me.
The rainy season began in early summer, and June had been no exception. It did not surprise the man when he discovered rainwater dripping from his dining room ceiling. Shrugging it off, he placed a tall pot beneath the leak and expected it to stop on its own. However, it continued to rain, and before he knew it, the pot would threaten to overflow. He had to dump the water out first thing in the morning and straight after he returned home from work. Eventually, he began to notice damage at the source of the leak. The white ceiling had discolored, turning a dull shade of brown. He checked the weather and realized that it would continue to rain sporadically over the next 10 days. The man was worried about the ceiling mildewing and becoming an expensive repair, so he called a local handyman. Unfortunately, the man could not sign to have the repairs done. Only his landlord could. It was a frustrating policy. The man called his landlord, but could not reach him. He left him a few voicemails, detailing how the damage was becoming progressively worse. The man was clueless as to why his landlord would not return his calls. They usually kept in touch, speaking at least twice a month. Finally, he reasoned that he would not be held accountable for any damages sustained. One night, the man was startled awake by a massive thump. He quickly turned on his bedside lamp, and just vaguely he could see an overturned table and a large shape laying across it. He sprinted out of his apartment and called the police, gagging at the smell. The man sat in the police station with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders and a coffee mug resting in his hands. He did know one thing. There had been a dead body in his ceiling, and the water had saturated it so badly that it caved under the weight. So far, the body was unidentifiable due to the rainwater and was being autopsied. While the man waited, he called his landlord and finally reached him, panicking as he explained the situation. His landlord was just as alarmed, and the man pleaded for him to come to the station while he made his statement. The man then paused as a detective crossed over to him, and he lowered his phone, wondering if the body had been identified. His blood ran immediately cold, and he shook his head with terror. The body belonged to Richard Thompson, his landlord, and he had died over a year ago. Some say on Halloween night, if you go past 7 black gates, you will see the 7 gates of hell. I thought it was a myth at first, until I tried it out. I went past 7 black gates around my neighborhood. Then, when I went to sleep, my dreams were of a furious fire. It stopped, and there was a man, tall and bulky. His eyes were rather squinted, showing his age, and his legs and hands were thin and looked as if they could barely support his weight. He spoke with a scratchy and dying tone, saying,
I have lost the magnificent Marlowe.
Chuckling, he opened the gate. My whole body became numb, and I was unable to fight it as it moved on its own. Struggling did not work. Without any control of myself, I went through the first gate. I saw fire and corpses that were horribly mutilated, desecrated, and burned. They were sobbing so loudly that I couldn't even hear the crackles of the fire. One came to me, with one eye and bullet holes all over him. He said,
"We are the desecrated corpses who did not get a proper burial. We are to stay here till the judgment day."
I went past him and to the second gate. It was in a building. I was in a dungeon. There were people tied up, screaming in pain. One was being sawed in half very slowly, his body repeatedly healing, ready to be sawed again. One was in an Iron Maiden, with the door being open and closed, but never causing any visible harm. A man in an executioner's mask said to me,
We are the torturers, tortured by our own devices.
I went past him to the exit, towards the third gate. This time, I was in a forest. It was silent except for a few yells. There was a man hanging from a noose. Another man fell off a cliff, reappeared and fell off again. I began running away from a horribly burned woman chasing after me. I already knew what this one was. These were the people who committed suicide. I ran through the fourth gate, which was in a palace. Suddenly, I was in the palace, surrounded by emperors, politicians, and really wealthy people. An emperor was being gnawed on by lions. When the lion ripped a limb off or slashed him, the appendage grew back and the injury healed. A politician was being beaten by what looked like shadows in prisoners' clothes. A man in a suit came to me and said,
"We are the corrupt. The people who used our power to help ourselves, not others."
I walked to the next gate, the fifth. I was in another room. There was a man tied up on a bed, being lashed by floating, spiky leather whips. A woman was being burned by a lighter, but her screams and cries were muffled by a cloth that was used as a gag. A rather large man came up to me and said,
"We are the rapists and the sex offenders, paying for our crimes on Earth."
I ran to the sixth gate. I stepped into a different room now. A man and woman were being stabbed, their wounds healing almost immediately, just like everyone else. Another person was being buried alive, and someone else was being hit and jabbed with a floating metal bar. I knew who these people were. Murderers. Being harmed the way they killed their victims. The exit was the seventh gate. The final one. This nightmare is almost over. It's almost over, I said to myself. I was outside. There was a man wearing a shroud over his head, coated with explosives. He blew up, regenerated, and blew up again. Another one was being beaten, stabbed by a sharp metal object, and burned like torches, lighters, and matches. They were held by people who looked like shadows. One of them came to me and said,
"They are the mass murderers, the terrorists, the suicide bombers. I am a shadow of one of their victims, beating them, in taking revenge for killing us on Earth.
I ran to the exit. When I woke up in the morning, I became terribly scared. The images of what I saw ran through my head. In fact, that was all I could think about for the whole year. It became Halloween again, and I didn't dare go outside that night. I just went to bed. It took me a while to sleep. When I did, I was in front of the first gate of hell. There was a teenager like me staring at me. He was shocked to see me. My body became numb and I could not control myself again. I said to him in a scratchy, dying tone, I chuckled and opened the gate for him. After he went inside with an expression that looked like he was fighting something and struggling, I looked at myself in the reflection of a goblet filled with what looked like blood. I saw the gatekeeper. I became the gatekeeper. In fact,
I am the gatekeeper.